rock stars. This is the sixth segment, if I remember correctly. So I have Matt Charney with me. Matt is an amazing person. I've known Matt for several years. When he was at Recruiting Daily, he worked there for quite a while and had given helped with my early writing content for me to get noticed on a couple of occasions, which I do appreciate. That was very helpful back in the day. So I've been writing ever since and doing a lot of things since then. So decided to bring Matt on as I'm starting my YouTube channel up. And so Matt Charney, take it away. Tell us more about yourself, about the industry. I think at some point along the way you were called one of the top 100 influencers in recruiting at one point.
I've gotten a bunch of those, honestly, but like that's also like saying I'm the smartest kid in the remedial class, right? Like I don't take it too much. First off, Mike, that was the first time that I've ever been introduced as a good person, as opposed to a good person to know or like chill with. So I appreciate that very much coming from you. And yes, so if you don't know me, I am Matt Charney, and I currently work as a W-2 employee for HR.com. I'll let you guess what that's all about. But essentially, I do all the TA stuff there. So it's basically like continuously fighting with HR ladies. My favorite activity from my current career as a recruiter. But beyond that, yeah, like I just am one of those giant nerds who like is really into technology, but not smart enough to be on the product side. Who's really into recruiting, but not enough of a people person to be on that side. So kind of splitting the difference. And I've been an analyst in the space for longer than I'm going to tell you. So it's good to be here, and hopefully this will help me make another list for my resume that I don't have. So that'll be good.
Yeah, I guess the question for you is, you have quite a few followers, right? I mean, what's your influence? I think you've gotten to the point where you have quite a few people that tune into your stuff and listen to you.
Yeah. So I mean, that's one of the questions that I struggle with, which is like, what is influence? In the sense that, so as an example, I have like 200,000 followers on LinkedIn, and that and $1 will buy me a cup of coffee, like great.
But why is that? Why do you have so many?
I mean, I've been doing this for a while too, and this is a true story. When they first launched the like LinkedIn Voices program, I want to say this is in 2015. It was literally like me, Bill Gates, and Ariana Huffington. Like it was the most random. I'm like, okay, why am I involved in this? So for a minute, LinkedIn was like driving me all these people. I'm like, I don't know what a follower is. I still don't, frankly. But essentially, that was all going gravy until I was kicked out for writing honestly about their product. So I was, they gave me a little boost there. But I'm pretty good engagement kind of across social, which I just populate really to entertain myself largely. But I think those are bad measures of influence. I think that the influence that I have that counts is almost all behind the scenes. And on the one hand, I help all my recruiter friends like find technologies because that's what I cover. So if you need an Oracle integration, like, I'll be able to tell you who to talk to at what company, right? Like stupid party trick. But the influence that matters to me the most, like, a proof of concept coming in this week, just because I have the luxury of having built a really good network. And unfortunately, like right now, so many recruiters' careers are in flux. It's making introductions to like really disparate nodes in my network. And I was able to get 2 people director level TA jobs who were out of work for a little bit of time this week. And that's something that I continue to do. I should probably start a search firm, but I've already given the milk away for free, as my grandma would say. So that's the only part of the influence I think that matters is getting people jobs. And in that, it's pretty good. Unfortunately, I don't have any like SQL developer jobs in India, or everyone in my InMay would be happy. But as far as recruiters, enterprise companies, knocking out of the park.
See, this is why I think that people follow you. And I'm just going to cut to the chase. You are no fluff, no frills. You get to the point. You're like you cut through the crap. Okay. And let's just say it like it is. I love your snark because you use your snark. We call you the king of snark, and there's a reason for that. And actually, I think that's a compliment to you because, quite frankly, I see that as a good thing because you're shining a light on stuff. You know how people put all this stuff out there just to get SEO, and it's some kind of title that's just to get clicks. And what I love, Matt, and I'm just going to give you this compliment. This is why I brought you on. Is it's you know as we get into this conversation, I just want you to know I think you cut through the fluff, and I think that's a good thing. It's not a bad thing, and that's a really powerful thing. So being snarky about cheesy click through titles for SEO just to get, the clickbait stuff and people making predictions in recruiting that are just totally off the wall, it drives me crazy. And so there have been times where you've put out good things that are actually very value added. And the work you're doing at HR.com for that matter, the project we worked on together on the hourly recruiting with all that data was very value added. And I think that just goes to show the influence right there, because that project had a lot of influence and there was a lot of TA influencers from across the industries. And that HR.com report was one of the most powerful things I've ever seen. It was so cool. So, and it
Yeah,
cut
and I
through the
only have to
fluff.
do one of
It
those
was
a
it
quarter,
was factual and it was on target, and there was no frills, no fluff. You know what I mean?
So here's the thing though, like, and this is my little secret, right? You can't be snarky or have an opinion without data validation.
Bingo.
And
That's right.
so, like, nobody, I'm not doing hot takes, right? I'll leave that to Chad and Cheese. But what I am doing is essentially the same thing you accuse me of, which is clickbait, which is taking a sensationalist position. Difference being, if you want to come at me, bro, I can validate it with a lot of like third
With data.
party
That's right.
data. And
Mhm.
like, it's really hard to argue with math unless it's taxes, right? So there you
Yeah,
go.
totally. And I think that's you speak to something that's so critical in the TA space right now. It's like so many people just don't know how to use data to tell the story of what's actually happening. And so, like, I'll give you an example. My SourceCon presentation was all data driven. Okay. And that presentation I did at HR.com, I pulled some of
Yep.
my slides from that presentation and put it in my SourceCon presentation to talk to sourcers and recruiters on the front line who, and I was just verifying what they felt like. Remote work is a thing. Uh, technology is a thing. Efficiency is a thing. COVID caused people to retire early, and that was a thing. Like all these different brain drain things, why the workforce was so insane, all the different things that were happening that were logical that we knew. I backed it up with data and I showed them. And I said, this is the trends and this is what's happening and this is the why. And when you get to the point with that, I was using stuff from Pew research, from Gallup. I was also using stuff from the Fed. So when I was able to take all these slides and put them together in one thing, the room was just, people were in awe. And the same thing, HR.com, when I did that presentation, I think I got some pretty good reviews on it.
Yeah, you
And
did.
it was a pretty remarkable thing because data is it's such a thing. And you know what I'm talking about, backing it up with real facts to say what's happening is such a powerful thing. And how do you do that? How do you find the data for one, and how do you qualify it?
Well, yeah. So I guess it depends on the market. Now, obviously, a lot of my work is U.S. based. So the Bureau of Labor Statistics, despite
Yeah,
any
great
qualms
resource.
anyone might have with the government, like they are so transparent in terms of both publishing and revising their statistics. They have a data finder on there. So if you really want to know any trend, like you can pull the data in a minute from there. I also use some third party technologies, things like Horsefly analytics, as well as Lightcast to just validate those. Those are fairly expensive if you're not an economist, but they're nice enough to give me access. So that's kind of on that front. If it's in the UK, I'm using their equivalent of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which is ONS, which I think is the Office of National Statistics over there. And if it's the EU or something like that, I'm using their exact body. So I always like to start at sort of a governmental source, because those are going to be the easy ones. After that, I'll go academic. So if something is peer reviewed, which is to say, if it's showing up on Google Scholar, which is kind of an underutilized tool in our space, I think. It's very dense, right? But at the same time, I trust it because it's been looked at by PhDs. And then third would be, I'll go down the value chain to either a Gallup or a big polling organization. My only problem with that data is it's attitudinal. Yeah. It's not necessarily like absolute. So those you have little qualms on methodology. I'm not going to get too much in the weeds, but for me, it's really just starting with either a thesis, like we learned in college, starting with a thesis, or starting with trying to undermine a hypothesis and then validating that. Also, those anchor links, to your SEO point earlier, perform better than keyword stuffing. So it's sort of a nice virtuous cycle there. But here's the thing: the data is out there for a large part when we talk about any trend in either technology or in human capital. Where it gets dicey is obviously on like an instance for instance, or like a so company specific or technology specific data. So like, do I have any way to undermine LinkedIn's claim that they have 300 million active users every month? No, I don't. Do I find that they have 1/3 of the world's population logging in to check their LinkedIn account every month when over a third does not have broadband access? It's unlikely, but I also can't disclaim it. So that's where I think.
And there's a lot of fake profiles on there too. LinkedIn does a lot of good stuff, but they also have a lot of fake profiles. And there's stuff that we've talked about. There's an old Steve Levy posting about the cartoon characters on LinkedIn. I will never forget that posting. Still makes me laugh to this day. It's so funny. Just go back and find it on recruitingblogs.com. It's a dang good article. But I was gonna say, I use ADP from time to time too, because they have a bunch of payroll data that is pretty accurate from the standpoint of just really great data. I mean, it's fantastic. It's clean. The ADP Research Institute has done a great job, in the stuff they put out. So I think it's highly accurate. Good view of the snapshot of the workforce too.
The only problem with ADP's data, to be honest, like the only problem is that it presupposes a W-2 or
right. Good point. Yeah, not the 1099 stuff, which is becoming more and more prevalent. Although they're getting better with that. When they bought Work Market, that is coming together where they're getting more insights into that space. I'm in the gig economy myself, so a lot of my content, you'll see some gig work on my channel. It's definitely. That's a thing. I mean, it's not going away. It's 46%. And I had Dermot O'Brien, who was the chief HRO officer of ADP back in the day, probably about 2 years ago, and he had some really great insights. He was also the chief transformation officer, but he had some great insights when he said that, in another interview with him the other day. So 46% of people in the United States at some point or another have taken part in the gig economy, was a stat he threw out, which I thought was pretty remarkable. So
yeah, and probably understated too.
Very well could be, yeah.
That just could entail a second job or somebody who's a consultant, right?
Yes, very true, yeah. And it's just this freelance gig work stuff is not going away. It's going to become more and more prevalent. I think it's interesting because we're meeting at the crossroads of, you have employment and traditional employment the way it's been for all these years, but this freelance work is becoming more and more prevalent as time goes on. And I think the pandemic just sped it up.
Yeah, 100%. Well, it's a vendor management system, right? So essentially you have a controlled marketplace with temporary labor that's being priced according to demand in real time. So that's just like going and getting a contingent worker via VMS. It's a lot easier to use, and it knocks out the middleman, which is smart on their part, right? Because you're making money on both sides.
Like DoorDash and Uber Eats and all these different,
Or
organizations
Uber
who use it.
Works
Yeah.
or Fiverr, yeah,
Favor. I
so
mean, there's all sorts of things. Yeah, it's interesting.
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Let's talk about AI. I mean, this is probably one of your favorite
Let's do it.
topics.
Yeah.
This is like one of the topics that is like always prevalent.
Yeah.
What's your
Well,
take on it? Where's it going? Where's it going to be in recruiting? What does that look like?
okay. So, this is something. This is a topic that I've been bored with for like 5 years. You can only imagine now. AI has actually supplanted diversity on my list of things that, like, why are we still talking about this? Actually, no, candidate experience might be number one. I'll put AI at number two. But here's the thing. So when I hear companies talk about AI, I do have the burden of having a fairly steep background in machine learning. And also, I have a minor in philosophy. So that brings in a little bit different slant than most people, particularly when it comes to ethics and particularly when it comes to that concept of intelligence, right? So first off, here's the thing. So within recruiting, anytime you hear a company right now talking about AI, they're talking about algorithm. They're talking about essentially training an algorithm, which is machine learning. And when they're like, it automatically matches candidates with job descriptions and creates a short list. That's not AI at all, actually. And like Conexa, when they bought BrassRing, had the ability to do that. I would not say that they had an AI system.
Now you're going way back in the day.
Saying Monster had those capabilities. They called it Sixth Sense in 2009. So it's nothing new. But because we're now seeing generative AI sort of take I wouldn't say that's anything new either. If you've seen Textio, for example, at work,
Right.
that's essentially the same use case as ChatGPT with a few less data points, but better and more recent information that they're pulling from. Either way, here's the thing. So I think the AI conversation at its heart is hilarious. So I just saw, for example, Workday made an announcement that they are now going to be the arbiters, not only of ethics and cybersecurity in AI, but they're going to rank every vendor on the market to make sure that you can trust your third-party AI provider. But they can't get an
Workday
applicant.
saying they can do that?
Well, I think what they're intrinsically saying is we actually don't have the technological capability to develop our own AI instance, so here's our services play. But I'll use that as an example. Like, if you can't make an applicant tracking system display on a mobile device, like, why are we talking about AI in the first place? Second,
they can't get their mobile down right. It's true.
Any recruiter out there can appreciate this. So if you look at any definition of AI, in order to train any machine learning instance against really any massive data set, you actually need one thing, and it's a precondition. It's called rational actors. You need rational actors on both sides in order to use basically past performance to predict future results. When in talent acquisition, has either the recruiter or the candidate ever been a rational actor? Like, there's so many.
We're dealing with people.
Exactly. So the variability makes the one foundation that's required for what's an amorphous concept nearly impossible. But on top of that, it's what we're describing as automation. And so I just read the Elon Musk book that Walter Eisenberg just put out a couple weeks ago. And as much as I'm not a fan of his, I'll go ahead and say that, he does say something interesting in there. And it's like his algorithm of work. And it basically says that unless you have the process down, optimized, and scalable to the point of where, with people, just people, to the point of perfection, then you don't know what you're automating. So you're just wasting your time by trying to automate stuff that hasn't already been optimized. And that's where we're at. And I think that, that's, if you recall, like when Tesla was going through their production troubles and SpaceX, that was the root cause of both was an over-reliance on automation and under-reliance on people. As he says in the book, people are underrated, as it turns out. And I think that we're going to learn that lesson the hard way. But here's the thing, even now, and you take out automation entirely, let's look at another use case, employee referrals, for example. Most companies will go out and look for software to fix that problem. But that's a process issue, almost unilaterally. And so when you take that to all of these different use cases that are being extended to AI, it seems to me to be putting the cart before the horse, only because fix your process before you try to implement a technological fix for a problem that you don't understand, right?
Yeah, such a good way of putting it.
Venture capital is going to make a lot of money off of it. A lot of companies are going to get sued. At the end of the day, all we're doing is building a conveyor belt that goes faster.
It's a great way of putting it. I love how you say that. So you did talk about diversity and inclusion a little bit. It's a necessary thing. And again, I think that's one of those things where data can really help.
Yeah, you want some?
What's your thoughts on diversity and inclusion? How can we make it better? What are some of the things that have been challenging with it, do you think?
Well, I mean, that's a very complex question. So there are a couple of points on D&I. So I absolutely agree that it is important. Like, it is essential. And here's the thing, though. It should not be a part of TA. Let's start fundamentally there. Because
that's
of
an
the
interesting thought.
Well, here's why. So there are two, the DOL kind of vague with a lot of their guidelines. Here are two that I would find that every single employment attorney in the country would agree with me on interpretation. One, quota-based hiring is illegal. You are not allowed to do it. Two, you are not allowed to use a protected characteristic in order to influence a hiring decision.
Yep.
Influencing a hiring decision and building a representative slate of candidates are fundamental to recruiting. But if you add that element in there, in addition to just kind of checking the box, they're both highly illegal. So I don't know why that is actually sitting in the function. But then taking a step back to HR. Okay, so if we talk about things like, pay equity. Well, here's the thing. The Geneva Accords have been around, the same things that, govern war crimes. Article 8 says that you have to give everyone equal pay for equal work. So that has been codified as international law since the 50s. In our own country, we had the Equal Pay Act passed in the 1970s. The Lilly Ledbetter Act, which basically just strengthened enforcement of the Equal Pay Act, was the very first piece of legislation that Barack Obama ever passed. Why are we still having this conversation? Because it is not in the best interest of capitalism to fix them, first off. But second off, when you look at that, when you look at things like race, for example, religion, sexual orientation actually is not covered federally right now. So, but just taking a look at those, you have some very entrenched societal problems that are the result of, I think, the word is intersections. They like to use, intersectionality. We're talking about the intersectionality between sociology, legislation, and like behavioral psychology. And if HR is still worrying about getting a seat at the table and how do I build a business case for my CEO, how are you going to try to combat entrenched systemic inequities combined with like some very glaring demographic shortages? Like, it is just not something that HR is capable of. And I would venture to say
that's a fascinating argument. Wow. Keep going.
Something that private industry is not capable of doing because you're not getting in early enough. There are things that we are capable of doing. So I'll give you an example, Mike, with data. So I'm going to say now this is 2021. This was last year's data set. In 2021, back when D&I spend was at its highest level historically, companies in the US were spending somewhere in the area of 40 billion with a B, every year only on unconscious bias training. Now, great. We can agree on unconscious bias doesn't impact hiring. Is it always bad? I don't actually know the answer to that. I think fight or flight is an unconscious bias, and that's kept us evolving for millions of years. But even that, let's go ahead and agree that it's a thing. There is actually no scientific evidence that says that even if people are aware of it, that its impact can be minimized and that it's going to actually change any outcomes. In fact, there are some scientific papers that have shown the opposite effect. The more aware of your biases are, because of what's called a availability heuristic, the more likely you are to act on them. But that's all a long way to say, A, it's never been proven. Two, a lot of people are making a lot of money. And three, if you were to take that amount of money, you could fund every historically Black college and university in the country's STEM programs for the next 50 years. instead of training your managers on how to minimize these kind of weird psychological phenomenon that's going to exist regardless, right? So that's why I have some problems with it as is, because if anyone actually cared about fixing the problem, the diversity industrial complex would go elsewhere. We wouldn't be still doing things like drug testing or not hiring people with felonies. If you look demographically at who that impacts, that is a disproportionate impact, something that is enforced by the DOL and the EEOC. So I just fail to understand how it is anything but virtue signaling, which has always sort of been my take, but now I can say virtue signaling and people know what that means, thankfully. So I can cut through the shorthand. But, is it important? Yes. Is it in our capacity to solve? Unfortunately, no. And if we're really so dedicated to combating biases, let's actually go and look at automation bias, which is to say the bias by which things performed by machines is intrinsically more valuable than that performed by people. And let's attack that one, given the zeitgeist, because that's fixable.
That's an interesting take, and I think I agree with you on many of those points. I think we have to do what we can within our power, within our organizations, to make it a better place for everybody. At the end of the day, that's the goal. Make your workplace more human across the board for every single person, regardless of their background. And again, we know that the things that you pointed out that are legal and illegal, that's kind of the starting place, but you can keep getting better. And the only way to really make headway is if your CEO is on board. Like you can't really do any of this if your top leader's not on board. I mean, you're going to be bumping your head against a wall. You're fighting a fight so that's that. If I had advice to diversity, equity, and inclusion leaders, it would be exactly that. Get your CEO on board. Get data to back up why it's good business sense, because that's one point of data we can use, is that it actually increases the bottom line. The good diversity.
Mike?
What's that?
Show me the study that uses that as causation instead of correlation, because I've yet to find it, by the way. There's the famous.
I'll send you something. I found something the other day that's pretty amazing. So
it's the one that's trying to do shareholder profitability to
no,
diversity?
Not that even. It's just there's a correlation to diversity that actually shows that the bottom line is affected by it, and it was ironically done by LinkedIn. So I'll find it for you. There's a really
correlation, not causation, and vendor sponsored. To our earlier point, I will look at it skeptically.
Okay. Well, yeah. I mean, I still feel there's some validity to, if you have a diverse workforce and they're serving your diverse customers, you're actually going to have more engagement as a net outcome. That was some data points I've seen that seem to support that thesis. But yeah, I think it's one of those things that we need to keep working on.
So. Yeah, absolutely agree. We have a long way to go.
Yeah, so what's another topic that we can talk about? You're doing all sorts of things. What about demographics? Let's talk about, you just had a really interesting conversation with some Gen Z folks. Let's talk about that. You had some fun doing that. You said you felt old.
So,
I actually watched that. It was really cool. It was really kind of neat to see you interacting with those guys, and they had some really interesting
those are my
takes.
boss's kids, so I had to be very nice. Yeah,
that's very cool. And they were smart. They were very smart.
They were very smart, right? I don't think more so than anyone. But so first off, yes, it was tragedy for me because I remember. So I went to Sherman 2000, and when I was there,
you're not dating yourself.
One of the speakers, was on Gen Y is coming, millennials in the workforce, and they said, if you're this age, stand up, and they started say 50, went down, and I was at the time, I think 22, which means I've really had an exciting life. I was going to SHRM at 22. I remember I was that person standing, and she's like, enjoy this moment, because you're going to look back someday and really savor being the youngest person in the room. And as it turns out, that is never happening again. So they were right. But here's the thing. So Gen Z is very interesting to me in as much as I was the millennial expert, I guess, because again of demography, it hasn't changed at all. Like, essentially, you're ascribing. We'll talk about diversity and inclusion. We're essentially taking stereotypes that are not data validated, cross applying them to an entire swath of the population, and then discriminating against them based on age. So, like, I
Interesting.
don't know.
So
Should we
yeah,
be talking
that's
about
I
this?
see that happening with Gen Z. Absolutely. I think there's a lot of
Yeah, but it
people.
happened with Gen Y, it happened with Gen X, it happened with Boomers. But here's the thing, let's go back to generational theory that we're using these terms was created to sell a book that was written in the year 1999 called Generations at Work, which kind of came up with this theory. And essentially, the only study that they did to validate this, and by the way, it was two Republican lobbyists, one of whom also performed with the amazing a cappella slash improv group, the Capitol Steps, if you're familiar with them. So he's like, the guy's like, oh, I'm a Bill. So yeah, these are the people you have to thank with no real academic background or record, so to speak of, for this phenomenon coming in the first place. The thing is, what group of teenagers did they study in order to come up with this concept of millennials, and by extension, the other generations, was actually in Arlington, Virginia, and the county school district there. It's the wealthiest county in the United States and one of the whitest. So when we talk about these traits, we are actually talking specifically about upper middle class to wealthy white people and their preferences and styles. So I think that it's not only an incomplete conversation, but it also is directly in combat with any talk of inclusion or diversity. That said, like, it sells consulting products, books, and gets people to click on shit. So I guess it will be one of those things that goes on until we figured out what have we figured out what the generation after this one's going to be called? Has McKinsey released that study yet? Because
I
I think,
don't know.
after you'd have to go back through and be like Omega,
Generation
maybe?
Zero.
Yeah, well, I think that's
We went
probably
to the
Gen
end of the
X.
alphabet.
Right? Yeah, so Omega, I think, it would be the next one, or as fraternities do, you'd now start with Alpha, Beta, and then continue to go. So the generation AB.
So
Either way,
I read a fascinating book. It's called A New Kind of Diversity by Tim Elmore.
okay,
And I think it was really well done. He was talking about how different generations on different teams are affecting the workforce and why it's so important to really engage the workforce in a certain way. But he had a really good take on it. Basically, he was talking about how important it is to make the workforce better for Gen Z, as well as helping different generations connect better in the workplace, which I thought was a really interesting take. It's just kind of helping them play in the sandbox better, right?
question: why wouldn't you want to make it a better place to work for all your employees and
Well,
design
that's what I
things
meant.
with
I was just
like
he's talking
intersectionality?
about the entire all generations and all
Right.
members of the workforce, but he was specifically focused on how generations interact with each other and trying to demystify that whole thing. And I think it was a good effort to he had some good scientific take on it, but it was a really interesting book. So I read it, liked it. But yeah, I think
I'll check it out.
the point is that Gen Z and all of our generations, sometimes I think we put labels on the younger generation unfairly, and we kind of put them in a box that really isn't accurate to every degree. And I think that
Yeah.
that comes about because, again, it's bias, right? There's a certain amount. I mean, it's a and
Well,
it
go back and
exists.
yeah, we'll go back and look at Bye Bye Birdie, which was written in the 1950s,
I
and
love
there's a
that
song in there
play.
called "Kids Today," right? Like,
Yes,
and it
yes,
is
yes.
literally
Yep.
to pass this Gen Y theory. There's this phenomenon called life, whereby your values change when you first graduate or go out into the workforce versus when you're trying to
Totally.
pay off a mortgage, and that's what the reflection is.
That's a
Is
really
it's
good
not
way of
nothing
putting it.
you
Yeah.
were born as much as it does where you are in your current life and what your
Yeah.
values are changed. That those are mutable.
Yeah. And I
So
think one of the biggest things that I think is becoming more and more important about talent engagement is the succession planning. We
yeah,
have to look at, where everybody is in the workforce, where they are and where they're coming from. So I think the biggest challenge is trying to connect all the dots with everybody in the organization in a way that helps get them all engaged. And so it's the the best performing companies that I can think of have to some degree addressed this issue within their culture. So like they're getting to the, I mean, some of the highest performing companies I've seen, they've done something with their DNA of their culture to some degree that helps engage more of their workforce. And so I think there's something to be said for that. Some of the best brands I know of have gotten some of that right. And there's still work to do, but I think, I'm trying to think of a good example off the top of my
I mean,
head.
I'll give you a good example. The most profitable company, second most profitable company in the world right now is Alphabet. They
Yes.
also have the
Uh-huh.
shortest tenure of any employee in the Fortune 500.
Wow.
So
Interesting.
let's go ahead and say that the key to engagement might actually be strategic disengagement. And you see that in a lot of the highest performing companies. Palantir, probably one of the most profitable companies in the world, somehow gets by with like 50 people. So,
Wow.
I think that it's a mixed bag, but, again, employee engagement at its highest level ever recorded by Gallup, it was, Mike? It was at 34%.
Wow.
So, and that's after God knows how much money and resources and effort. So at the end of the day, like we talk about, like, this is the cheesiest thing in the world, but, it's still true. Like, people are a thing that is the commonality between all of this BS and complexity. At the end of the day, cracking the human equation, which is basically addressing psychology, sociology, and everything else that goes into the human psyche and condition. Those are the things you need to understand, not whatever theory happens to like be in vogue. If and people talk about emotional intelligence, and
Yes. Mm-hmm.
I'd love to dismiss that concept, but I think that there is some validity to that. I think you can always train somebody on skills, but you can't untrain an asshole, is a general rule. So like
That's so true.
attitude is really what it comes down to. And at the end of the day, when we talk about recruiting, we talk about succession management, it all comes down to making a hire, treating them well, and empowering them to expand and grow professionally and dimensionally. None of these things require technology. None of these things require an employer brand. None of these things necessarily require any candidate experience beyond don't be a dick. So I fail to see how we are doing a great service to ourselves when we are taking the focus so much away from people and putting it so much onto some of these other topics that don't really matter nearly as much as like.
See, this is again why it's just sometimes it's so simple. It's just treat people with respect and dignity.
The
That's
golden
it.
rule, turns out. Yeah.
It's amazing to think that just that one concept, if we could get more people to actually do that. Now, that's the other thing is look at these past few years from the standpoint of the political dialogue and discussion. It's virtually null, right? So what we've gotten away from is we've gotten to a point where society is very emotional, but nobody can come to the middle ground. Like it's such an annoying thing. It's like we could do so much for the common good if we just looked past the differences and got to what actually unites us. And in some
And I would say
respects,
this, though, you're absolutely right, because every good recruiter, the best recruiters I know, have an ability to find a commonality as quickly as possible with anyone, even if they're as disparate as possible.
yep,
And so
yep,
I think that anyone can come together. Maybe it's not around anything other than you probably like the Jazz.
yeah,
I'm gonna guess, and
yeah,
I like the Mavericks, and both our teams are probably going to be pretty competitive in the Western Conference. We could sit here and talk about that for 20 minutes,
yeah.
and boom, that's affinity. Like, it's not that hard.
Yeah, I mean, you can find common ground on a number of things, and it really it just respecting other people for the right reasons and doing it ethically. I mean, it just seems like such a concept, doesn't it? It's like common sense to me, but then I mean, we could throw data at this all day long and show all these business cases as to why this makes sense. But unless, again, goes back up to your leadership, unless your leadership's on board, it's a it's a lost cause. And you have to kind of, I mean, you have to be able to speak the language of data to get those leaders on board, and most will be when you show them practical and, most will, I think. But again, this is such an interesting thing. I mean, we're in such a crazy time, and I think it just these past few years. What about COVID? What do you think COVID did to talent in general? What's your take on that? And it accelerated a bunch of things, didn't it?
It did accelerate a bunch of things. I don't know that it changed anything like immutably,
Mm.
right? Other than the fact that we understood for the first time. We used to hear people talk about hourly workers and frontline workers in sort of a dismissive way, or almost an elitist attitude. And so I think the one empowering thing I've seen is that now, given the huge shortage in those industries that we're facing, they're
People
finally
value it
being
more.
seen. They're being seen as essential workers, right? Which is
Yes,
what we called
exactly.
them during the pandemic. We should have always called them that, because good luck getting table service at a restaurant,
Yep.
without them. So all that is say that I think is really one of the more profound changes. Unfortunately, they also don't have the luxury of remote work, which, by the way, I have not worked in an office since 2012.
Wow.
So I just now companies are catching up. Kind of sucks for me because I do video calls, so I can't do other stuff during the day. But all that said, like, there's a reason why everyone on that day was able to go home, and they're like, oh, I could do my job from home. Yeah, you always could. It's your company that wanted to waste the money on a Class A office space and not your salary or benefits. So, talk to CapEx. So, I think that here's what COVID ultimately did was it created a lot of opportunities for people to take a step back, rethink and reassess what they prioritize. And when you see churn happening at the extent that it is, where people are not just bouncing companies, but bouncing careers, I think it just perpetuated the equivalent of midlife crisis, but on a societal level. And I don't think that has been an entirely bad thing, because the fact that we're even sitting here and ethics came up twice now, and it came up in everything that I do, that's something that we're talking about, I find to be relatively encouraging.
Yeah, it's so true. And I think, what advice do you have for recruiters, for HR people right now? I mean, that are going through some hard times, been displaced. I mean, what would you put out there for any of those folks? Just some of your advice.
Yes. So, I mean, it's hard for me because, on the one hand, there's not much you can do independently. And I feel like I would be pandering if I said the tricks to how to network your way into a job, right? But ultimately, I think that it is important to remember that you're going to be a candidate again if you're a recruiter, which is all you need to say about candidate experience. Like, why are we laboring the process? Look at it now, right? And then on the other hand, like, if you're a candidate, you're going to be in a position where you're going to be hiring people who never called you back or reviewing their resumes. It's a continuous cycle that you've been a part of as long, for at least as long
Hmm.
as I have. So ultimately, it comes back to not being a dick, because karma is going to catch up with you. Even if you just stop and give advice to somebody who's looking for a job and you can't help them, they're going to remember that. And there's a good chance, especially in this business, that person is going to go on to run talent acquisition, or at least be in a function where they can help you or hurt you in
Yeah,
the future.
very true. Yeah, I remember one of my favorite articles on recruiting blogs that I wrote was the time, and I go back in time here because this brings back such a memory, because I remember you commented and you said something, this is real and human, on that article. You probably remember it. But what I was talking about was the happiness a candidate expressed to me when I treated them like a human being, and
Yeah.
how rare that was when they had
You know what's rare,
experienced that
Mike?
at the time. You know what I mean?
What? Yeah. What's rare is, and I probably said that comment was because you put yourself out there and talked in the first person about an experience that you had, as opposed to using, the third person we, uh, like, for themselves, and citing a bunch of crap like, Gallup surveys and the third party data. Like, if you have an experience, that's the thing that's worth sharing, and that's the thing that humanizes you, right? And so
Totally.
I wish more recruiters would have the guts to say, I'm looking, and here's my frustrations, and here's what I'm going through, as opposed to our tendency to hide that fact for shame. because
Absolutely. Yep. So true. And but this is where it expresses. So we talk about candidate experience and how much work still needs to be done. I mean, I have seen so many postings. You go to your LinkedIn feed, and every other one's like, I have been looking for a recruiting job for 6, 7, 8 months, whatever, and they're not returning my calls. They're not closing the loop with me, blah, 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 blah. Well, if they're doing that to their own, so a recruiter's looking for a recruiting job and we're treating other recruiters that way, ooh. And you know how, I mean, that's like a lot. So two things. That is killing your employment brand by the very people that could actually help you expand your employment brand.
yep,
And it's also getting the word out amongst the folks that do hiring. And then when you need the top talent of recruiting to come to your organization and you're treating them like that, you're not going to get them. It's
it's
just
feast
like
or
you
famine.
said, once again, it's that it seems so logical to me, but to others, it does. I mean, I don't know why some organizations just fail to close the loop. When you bring in
Uh,
someone, you close the loop with them, you tell them where they were, you tell them what happened, you give them the closure. You interview that person over the phone, whatever, you give them feedback to some degree, even if you're not going to hire them, just say, hey, we went forward with other candidates, close the loop. And you don't, I mean, one of the best things I ever saw was a note. Man, this was so cool. They actually took the time to write, and it was pretty clever. Like the organization had this closure note that says, we've seen 1,000 different resumes, but you were enough to catch our attention and look at your information. We're so grateful that you took the time to apply to us. It was very short and sweet, but it was really creative. And so it added a couple things that were pretty friendly, and I just liked how it acknowledged that they had applied, and just, I don't know, stuff. It seems so simple to me, but
it is really simple. And here's the thing: you don't only recruit for one rec, so I don't know why you're not having that conversation in the first place, right? Like a good recruiter knows where their pipeline sits, where their attitudes are, and is already thinking a step ahead about that rec that might open and where they can fit into an organization. So
right.
if you're
Where
just
can they take that person and put
out,
them in another
like
opportunity? Yeah.
that's where you're going to get replaced by AI, right? That is a stack ranking use case.
Uh-huh. Yep.
But if you can be like, this person would really kind of personality wise get along with this hiring manager, let me set up an informational. Well, you're just going to look good and you've added value to both sides, right?
Yeah. Totally.
So, like,
It's
it's
such
in
a
your best
battle.
interest.
Yeah. Well, this was a fun conversation. Is there anything else you want to say today?
I would just like to say thank you for having me on, and keep up the good work.
Yeah, we're excited. Well, this will go out either today or tomorrow, and
Awesome.
I'll tag you in it. So, do you have a YouTube channel out there?
I maybe, but nothing that I've populated for quite some time. So no, I
You're
don't.
on.
But if you can find it, forcing a word of the year.
Well, so good to talk to you, and you are one of a kind. And I think it was a great conversation. Really enjoyed it, and thank you for the time.
Hey, thank
Mike
you, Mike. We'll
Rasmussen
talk to you
from
soon.
Where's Your Next? Thanks for being on, Matt.